You know, sometimes it's the most unassuming things that tell the biggest stories. A single object can totally unlock a hidden history of how a nation was built. And today, we're going to do exactly that. We're going to use one mysterious item to uncover the really surprising origins of the U.S. government.
And this is our key. Check this out. It's a remarkable, hand-drawn map from 1793. Now, what's wild is that this thing was never printed. It was probably used internally by the brand new American government, which, remember, was based in Philadelphia back then. It's like a snapshot in time, a picture of a nation that's still trying to figure out, where its borders are and what its future even looks like.
So, okay, the big question is, what can an old map like this really tell us? Well, as it turns out, it's basically a portal that leads us straight to one of the most powerful and honestly most misunderstood institutions in early American history.
All right, so first things first, we've got to play detective here and decode the clues that are hidden right on the map itself.
So if we zoom in and look really closely at the map's title, that fancy little box called a cartouche, we find our first huge clue. It literally calls this a map of the route from Philadelphia to the Indian Treaty of 1793. So boom, this wasn't just some generic map of the frontier. No way. It was made for a very specific, very high-stakes negotiation between the U.S. and a coalition of Native American nations.
Now, to get why this treaty was such a big deal, you gotta understand the context. Back in the 1790s, this whole region, the Ohio River Valley, was an absolute powder keg. You had the young United States, you had powerful Native American confederacies, and you had the British, all fighting for control. This map, it was a tool designed specifically to navigate that crisis. In the end, though, the treaty talks completely fell apart. The American commissioners just wouldn't accept the Ohio River as a permanent boundary, so no deal. The negotiations failed. But the map? The map survived. Which leads to the next big question. Who made this thing? Who is behind it?
And that, right there, brings us to the institution at the very heart of our story, the early U.S. War Department. Now, look, while we can't be 100% certain, all the evidence points in one direction. It strongly suggests this map was commissioned by the War Department. See, they were the federal agency in charge of managing the frontier. And that didn't just mean fighting, it meant diplomacy too.
The War Department was created way back in 1789 by the very first Congress. It was one of the original pillars of the whole executive branch. But, and this is the key thing we're about to get into, its name was, well, it was incredibly misleading.
To really get how this department worked, we need to look past the famous generals and the big-shot politicians. We've got to find the person who actually ran the place, day in and day out.
And that person was the chief clerk. I love this quote from historian Leonard White. He called this position the pivot on which daily business turned. Just think about that. Secretaries of War, they'd come and go with politics. But the chief clerk, they were the constant. They were the institutional memory of the whole department.
And get this role was unbelievably stable. It was created in 1789, and the title Chief Clerk was still officially on the books in 1952. That's over 160 years. These were career civil servants, and they provided a kind of continuity that the political appointees just couldn't. You can even see the government's pecking order back then just by looking at the salaries from 1789. The chief clerk for the War Department made less than the one at the State Department. It just shows it started out as a smaller operation. But, as we're about to see, the War Department's importance was about to totally explode.
Okay, so now let's contrast that permanent, stable civil servant with the guy at the top, the political appointee.
The head of the whole department was the Secretary of War, and these guys were political figures, often with really strong partisan beliefs. A perfect example from this period is a guy named Timothy Pickering. He was a die-hard Federalist, and he was deep in the political trenches of his day.
I mean, Pickering's resume was pretty impressive. He was the Postmaster General, then Secretary of War, then Secretary of State for 2 different presidents, and then later a U.S. Senator. So yeah, a major political player. But he was also a really polarizing figure, especially known for his intense hatred of France.
And it's under secretaries like Pickering that the true role of the War Department starts to come into focus. And let me tell you, it was way bigger than you'd think. This was not just about the Army.
The early War Department was pretty much the department of, well, almost everything. Seriously, It handled diplomacy with native nations, it managed pensions for veterans of the Revolutionary War, it even oversaw the creation of the entire U.S. Navy. It was a true administrative powerhouse.
I mean, just take the Navy, for example. Before there was a separate Department of the Navy, Congress told the War Department to build the nation's first 6 frigates. We're talking about legendary ships like the USS Constitution. And it was Secretary of War Pickering who was overseeing the start of that massive project.
And it was the same story with diplomacy. That role was absolutely central. In 1794, Timothy Pickering himself was named the sole agent for the U.S. to negotiate a landmark treaty with the really powerful Six Nations Confederacy. This wasn't some side job for them, this was a core function.
So what does all this add up to? What's the real legacy of this early department that, did pretty much everything?
When you look at it, the War Department basically acted like an incubator for the whole U.S. federal government. All these different functions that started under its roof, things like Indian Affairs, veteran pensions, even naval construction, they all eventually got so big that they were spun off to become their own separate, dedicated agencies.
And that brings us right back to where we started, with our map. This one simple document, made for a treaty that didn't even happen, helps us completely reframe how we see things. The War Department wasn't just about war, not even close. It was one of the central, foundational pillars that the rest of the entire federal government was built on.
It's an amazing story, really. It shows how one single department can be the seed that grows into these huge, sprawling branches of government. Which kind of leaves us with one final thought to chew on. What does this hidden history tell us about how governments actually grow, how they adapt, and how they evolve over time?